If there's one genre where the Sega Saturn excels, it's racing games. Whether it's Daytona USA's power sliding, Sega Rally's gear drifting, or Sega touring cars, music. The arcade gore of the mid-90s was eating well on the Sega Saturn. That said, throughout its lifespan, Saturn would accumulate a multitude of racers from a variety of developers, all keen for a slice of the pie that Sega was enjoying. However, as the years and decades have rolled by, the Saturn's racing genre seems to be confined in conversation to the big arcade ports, with perhaps only Psygnosis' WipEout series receiving any mention otherwise, and even then, only in dismissive comparisons with PlayStation. Sega's arcade racers inspired developers, and while results varied in terms of quality, many of the games tried to add something extra on top of a bare bones arcade experience, with story modes, campaigns, car mods and influence from real life Japanese culture. I'm James, the SEGAHolic of the Sega Guys, and these are the 10 most obscure and underrated Sega Saturn racers. What happens when you take Burnout, throw in a bit of Road Blasters and add a WipEout style techno soundtrack? The answer is Impact Racing. You start the game with a basic laser, with a preset target of how many enemies, aka rival cars, you have to destroy to qualify for the bonus stage at the end of the race. These bonus stages are vital, because success in those awards players with new weapons such as heat-seeking missiles and smart bombs that you take into the next round, and you'll need them as the difficulty increases. Your car is also equipped with landmines which are dropped behind your car for other racers to run into, and the game cleverly shows a map on the top right hand corner showing where your rivals are on the track, as well as where you dropped your mines. It becomes a game of keeping one eye on the road and the other on the map. Visually, Impact Racing looks as good as you'd expect from a third-party Saturn title of the era, with a respectable draw distance and reasonably detailed track environments. The tracks themselves start off in the usual kind of surroundings, such as a city, the countryside and snowy mountains, but eventually take the player into space with the Andromeda Galaxy in the background. Handling in Impact Racing is pretty forgiving, don't expect much in terms of drift mechanics here. As mentioned earlier, you're given a target of how many cars you need to destroy before each race, and destroying rival cars is life in Impact Racing, literally. Taking down rivals drops power-ups in the form of ammunition and armour to boost your energy levels, as well as time bonuses, which you will need. As someone who owned Road Blasters on the Atari Lynx back in the day, Impact Racing hit that nostalgic sweet spot, although like all the games on this list, it's advised to come to them for the first time with an appreciation of the era that they released in. Cyber Speedway is a futuristic racer where players use hovercrafts known as sleds, with races held on different planets throughout the course of the game. Known as Grand Chaser in Japan, the game's title was changed along with its soundtrack by Sega of America for its Western release, with Koji Hayama's music being replaced by tracks by Bygone Dogs, who provided music for Wild Woody on Mega CD, as well as the Saturn's bootleg sampler demo disc, Congo the Movie, Gen War and Bug 2. In fact, the opening music track on Cyber Speedway is featured as the backing track for the More Games reel on the bootleg sampler demo disc. Quite why Sega of America felt the need to omit Hayama-san's work is anyone's guess, but the new music sounds ridiculously out of place in the game's setting. The sledges in Cyber Speedway were designed by Sid Mead, famed for his work in Hollywood as an industrial designer, working on movies such as Tron, Aliens and Blade Runner, and the default sled in the game reminds me so much of the ship in The Flight of the Navigator. Gameplay wise, Cyber Speedway features a story mode, complete with comic book style cutscenes as players assume the role of Clay Shaw, representing Earth in races, the result of which will settle disputes between planets at war. It's possibly one of the silliest plots that I've ever read for a game. You know, planets are at war, but rather than kill billions of people, we'll just get in these sledges and have some races to decide what happens. The free run mode, as the game suggests however, allows players to choose any of the game's tracks with the exception of the final track, which is only playable on advanced level during story mode. Handling involves using the left and right shoulder buttons to make aggressive sharp turns. Think WipEout's air brakes but with a handbrake yanked at 120 miles an hour and you get the idea. Visually the tracks are bland in terms of detail while being different enough from one another to stand out. However, the new music from Bygone Dogs is painfully out of place in Cyber Speedway and sounds like it should be a track in an off-road themed racer. If you have to play this one though, stick to the Japanese version. The Saturn port of Rad Mobile that looks like Rad Mobile but isn't Rad Mobile, Gale Racer, released in late 1994, shares many similarities but makes several key changes to the arcade original. First off, let's address the elephant in the room, the draw distance. As you can see, and have probably noticed, it's insanely short. You can literally see less than 10 feet in front of your car, and the game becomes more about learning the patterns of traffic and rival cars as much as it does about learning the layout of the roads. In stage 1.2, the Mojave Desert, you're advised to watch out for oncoming cars before one literally appears right in front of you to your left hand side, while a stream of traffic crosses your path from right to left, also out of complete thin air. Speaking of stages, in Rad Mobile each round follows on immediately when crossing the checkpoint, similar to Outrun, but on Gale Racer the stages are broken up into areas with a time summary screen to hide the load times. Gale Racer on Saturn runs at half the frame rate of Rad Mobile in the arcade, and one key change is that the 2D sprite-based rival cars and traffic have been replaced by polygonal ones. Some have used this as a reason why the Saturn version is so below par, but future titles like Sega Rally and Daytona USA CCE have shown that the Saturn can more than handle a port of a then 3-year-old Sega System 32 game. The thing with Gale Racer though is that it seems confused about what it wants to be. Is it its own game? Is it a port? Despite being rebranded as Gale Racer, the Rad Mobile banners fly overhead in the game, just like they do in the arcade. The Sonic the Hedgehog mascot swings from its chain above your head, just like it does in the arcade. The cockpit view and layout are identical to the arcade. For all intents and purposes, this is Rad Mobile. But, to quote John Travolta in Face Off,
"It's like looking in a mirror, only not."
It's a shame about the draw distance, because there's a really fun racer in here, with clever gameplay mechanics like pressing the left shoulder button to turn on your headlights in dark stages, and the right shoulder button to turn on your wipers in stages with torrential rain. The game won't do those things for you. If you can be bothered to memorise the track layout and the patterns of rival cars and oncoming traffic, perhaps you could have some fun with this one. But if you really want to play Rad Mobile and you have access to MAME, you may be better off just emulating the System 32 original. I love Sega and I love Initial D, so an Initial D game on the Sega Saturn should be right up my street, right? Well, yes and no. You see, while Sega Rosso's amazing Initial D special stage was enough to make me chip a PS2 Slim just to play the console port in 2003, the Saturn game is nowhere near as playable or enjoyable, although it has to be stressed that this is an original game by Genki produced long before the arcade versions. First off, the Saturn version gets kudos for its presentation. The cutscenes, voice acted and subtitled entirely in Japanese, capture the feel of the anime series perfectly. The game itself visually does a great job of capturing the vibe of the series, with Takumi's Toyota Terreno A86 faithfully recreated, along with the winding roads and hairpins of Mount Akina. When racing, you see your rival's expression change via the anime face on the top left of the screen, and anyone who's watched the series will be all too familiar with the look of sheer shock and awe as Takumi somehow appears right behind his opponent in their vastly superior car. What is missing, however, is the music. There's every chance that if you love Initial D, you love Eurobeat, and without Night of Fire, Speedy Speed Boy, Running in the 90s or Space Boy blaring from the speakers, it just doesn't feel like Initial D. Now, A patch was released back in 2021 that added Eurobeat tracks to the game. However, it doesn't appear to work properly with the Fenrir ODE, which repeats one track over and over. What makes the Saturn version less enjoyable though is the handling. You have buttons for gas and brake as expected, but also a button for drift, and the drifting mechanics are insanely tough, and no matter how often I play Initial D on the Saturn, I cannot drift anywhere near as good as the CPU Takumi does in the game's attract mode. The cars feel almost too light, and it's a shame, because if the handling and drifting was closer to that of, say, Daytona USA on Saturn, this would be absolutely brilliant fun. High Velocity Mountain Racing Challenge, as the name suggests, sees players face off in head-to-head battles on mountain passes in Japan. Routes consist of tight turns, hairpins and winding tunnels. Some courses have multiple routes and shortcuts, and, like Initial D, rely on drifting mechanics to make it to the end in first place. In High Velocity, the drifting is more forgiving, although it can be twitchy in places with oversteer easily triggered if you're too heavy-handed. Players can choose from King Battle mode, where you face off against a single rival in a series of 6 heats, which can be played in any order, with each heat consisting of 2 laps. There's also a time trial and a 2-player versus battle. The controls on High Velocity combine the brake and the handbrake into the B button, something you don't see often in racers. In fact, most racers of that era will simply have either a brake button or a handbrake button. If you press B while keeping the gas pedal pressed, it will act as a brake. If you take your finger off the gas and press the B button, it acts as a handbrake. High Velocity is a solid enough looking racer for the time, with good draw distance and detailed track environments, and the game sets the scene perfectly by showing the scale of the mountain you're racing on. When racing downhill, you'll often see the lights and skyscrapers of the city miles beneath you twinkling in the night sky, and while it's only a 2D image, I think it looks brilliant. In Japan, High Velocity was better known as Toge King the Spirits, and was the only game in the Toge series to see a Western release on Saturn. Where do I start with Scorcher? In the comments for my best 3D games on the Sega Saturn video, a viewer named Simon Robinson gave the game praise for its 3D engine, and I have to say that I agree with him. The tracks and environments clearly take influence from WipEout, and even the soundtrack has some tunes that sound eerily similar. Listen to the music on the first track in Scorcher, and you could be forgiven for mistaking it for Cold Comfort from WipEout. Where Scorcher differs to WipEout though is the crafted player controls. These aren't hovercraft per se, but look like the giant balls from the Atmosphere event on Gladiators. I mean, who knows, they could have easily been inspired by those given the time frame, but we'll never know for sure. If you look closely, the player's craft is inside that glowing green circle, which rotates as it rolls along the track. Players can boost using A, with power-ups for your boost collected as you race. Pressing the C button makes your craft leap into the air, which isn't required in the first track, but as you progress through the game, jumping becomes a necessity. In fact, the third stage is a dramatic leap from the previous two, as it resembles something more like Super Monkey Ball, with gaps in the track that you can literally fall through. Likewise, go too fast around bends on any track, and you'll go flying off the edge, costing you time. The 90s was a golden era for Formula 1, with legendary drivers and technical innovation year on year as teams pushed their cars to the very limit. Of course, as with any popular sport, there has to be a video game, and Sega systems are no stranger to F1 games, with the likes of Super Monaco GP and Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2 making their way to the Mega Drive. In the 5th gen, however, it was PlayStation owners who had the F1 bragging rights, with the brilliant officially licensed Formula 1 game by Bizarre Creations published by Psygnosis that hit UK shelves in September 1996. However, Saturn owners did get an F1 game of their own first, releasing in March 1996. F1 Challenge is a more stripped down experience than the one found on Sony's system, but there's still a solid enough racer here. In Grand Prix mode you can choose from 5 drivers: Michael Schumacher at Benetton, Damon Hill at Williams, Mika Hakkinen at McLaren, Jean Alesi of Ferrari, and Ukyo Katayama of Tyrrell. Ironically, the other F1 teams are represented in the game, but only as AI rivals on the field of 24 cars. In terms of courses, there are only 3 real-life ones to play on: Hockenheim, Suzuka and Monte Carlo, aka the Monaco Grand Prix, and there are plenty of tweaking options for your car before hitting the track. Visually, F1 Challenge is more than decent. It moves at a good frame rate and the draw distance is on par with any of the best racers on the system. What makes F1 Challenge stand out though is the live camera on the top right corner of the screen, which shows your race in a similar angle to that seen in a live F1 television broadcast. It would be easy for Saturn owners to feel left out when looking for an F1 game, and I vividly remember my PlayStation owning friends in high school chatting about the Formula 1 game at break time. But for me, if Sega had managed to get access to the entire F1 licence, including all the teams, all the drivers and all the courses, there's absolutely no reason why F1 Challenge couldn't have gone toe to toe with anything on the PlayStation. Developed by Jaleco, GT24, released in 1996, is better known as Super GT 24 Hours in the arcade, where it ran on Sega's Model 2 board. And while the arcade game looked the part, the Saturn port, also developed by Jaleco, strips back much of the detail found on the tracks and cars. The layout of the tracks mirror the arcade game, and as the name suggests, races revolve around the Le Mans style 24-hour format, with daylight changes crammed into several laps. Handling in GT24 can range from acceptable to absolutely wild, with drifting triggered by the slightest of touches on the controller. This can often send your car spinning out of control and left facing the other way, but when you get to grips with the controls, there are some decent races to be had. It's not the best Model 2 port on the system, and the stripped back visuals have a real Ridge Racer vibe in places, but there's far worse Racer on the Saturn than GT24. Western Sega fans may associate the Tokyo Highway Battle games with the Dreamcast, but Drift King Shutokou Battle 97 on the Sega Saturn blends an arcade racer with a deceptively deep borderline simulation racer. As with most racing games of this type, you choose a basic car and start with a pocket of cash, which can be used to give yourself a couple of modest upgrades before hitting the road. Drift King 97 eases players into things, but eventually you will hit a wall that requires you to spend money on additional upgrades. The racing in Drift King 97 is solid for the most part, with detailed if not overly challenging tracks and slow moving traffic to contend with. The most annoying traffic obstacles come in the form of buses, pretty much like driving in Glasgow city centre then. The game does however get quite repetitive due to its setting, something that I also mentioned when putting Tokyo Highway Challenge last on my list of best Dreamcast racers. The scenery can get boring quite quickly, especially when you get into the habit of playing the same race over and over to harvest cash for that much needed upgrade to progress. Sega Saturn owners in the West would miss out on this one, but the game did come to all regions on the PlayStation, with both versions having their own quirks and differences. The PlayStation version, as was common for the era, features better transparency effects, while the Saturn game runs at a higher resolution. According to Sega Retro's entry for the game, both versions use the same 2D assets, which results in Saturn having something of an edge, for lack of a better word, in that the assets are stretched on the PlayStation. If you can see past the repetitive nature of the tracks, there's a fun and deep racer to be enjoyed here, but Drift King 97 will demand your time to allow you to see all that it has to offer. Genki are back for the final game on the list with Wangan Dead Heat aka Highway 2000 when released in Western regions. Looking at the game in action, it definitely gives off Ridge Racer vibes. The setting is so similar, with high grey walls, grassy runoff areas and large skyscrapers on the horizon. However, the two versions of this game are completely different in terms of context, because while Highway 2000 focuses on the races and feels very much like a traditional arcade racer, the Japanese version requires you to choose from one of 10 ladies, aka co-drivers, who you must impress by placing first in races. These interactions are shown in cutscenes, both when choosing your co-driver and after races. If you fail to win, you get a cutscene showing your chosen lady look through the driver's window at you before walking away unimpressed with your skills. The co-driver feature was removed entirely from the Western release. However, the intro to the PAL version does open with shots of bikini-clad women, hinting that perhaps there was a plan in place to replicate the plot of the Japanese version, but tailored for Western audiences. The US version removes any reference to women at all. It gives an insight into the attitudes of the three divisions at Sega at the time. Sega of Japan be like, pick a car, pick a woman, drive fast, impress her, woo her, then watch these cheesy and incredibly awkward FMV cutscenes. Sega Europe are like, yeah, here's some bikini babes in the intro, but that's your lot, just drive the damn cars. And then Sega of America are basically, censor this shit, no woman anywhere. Back to the game itself though, handling wise, Highway 2000 feels near identical to the previous game, Drift King 97. No surprise given that both games are developed by Genki. The sense of speed is far greater in Highway 2000 than Drift King 97, but at the end of the day, both games are so similar they could easily be mistaken for one another. The tournament mode sees you race in a preset order of tracks, and you need to place high enough in order to proceed to the next stage. Don't finish high enough, it's game over. There's also a time attack mode though, which allows players to see more than the first track if you're not good enough to get past it. None of the games on this list are going to challenge Sega Rally, Daytona or WipEout for the title of Best Racing Game on Saturn. But what they do show is the influence that both Sega's arcade racers and PlayStation's WipEout games had on developers. Whether it's post-apocalyptic worlds, techno soundtracks or drift racing, each game here has nods to those who blazed the trail. If you've made it to the end, thank you as always for watching, and if you haven't already and you're new to the channel, have a look around. There's plenty of Sega goodness across all platforms, as well as our fortnightly Sega Guys podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me on Twitter at the SEGAHolic. You can find my co-host Dan the Mega Driver at Strooper_D, and the pod account is of course at Sega Guys. Thanks again for watching, and until next time we will see you on the Sega side.